Good evening. I'm Lisa German, University Librarian and Dean of Libraries, and I'm delighted to welcome you to a Feast of Words, co-sponsored by the Friends of the University Libraries and the Campus Club. Thank you so much for your co-sponsorship of this important event. Past feasts began with dinner together. For tonight's virtual event, I hope you've brought your appetite for stimulating conversation. We'll hear an inspiring talk by our unapologetic omnivore, Dr. John Wright, Professor Emeritus, who will be joined afterwards by Curator Cecily Marcus. I'm also very happy to announce that in our virtual audience tonight is University President Joan Gable. Welcome, President Gable. Thank you so much for including a Feast of Words in your University of Minnesota event series on voice, art, and community, which features diverse voices throughout the arts and humanities. We ask that you, our guests, remain muted through the program, and you'll notice two buttons at the bottom of your screen. Please use the chat button if you have technical questions, and the Q&A button if you have questions for Dr. Wright. You may submit your questions at any time, and we'll get to as many as possible after the conversation. Before we begin, I'd like to share a perspective that's important to all of us. The University of Minnesota Twin Cities is built within the traditional homelands of the Dakota people. It is important to acknowledge the people on whose land we live, learn, and work as we seek to improve and strengthen our relations with our tribal nations. We also acknowledge that words are not enough, and we must ensure that our institution provides support, resources, and programs that increase access to all aspects of higher education for American Indian students, staff, faculty, and community members. Thank you. Now let's turn to Cecily to introduce herself and Dr. Wright.
Hello, everybody. I'm Cecily Marcus, Curator of the Gibbons Collection of African American Literature, the Performing Arts Archives, and the Upper Midwest Literary Archives at the University of Minnesota Libraries. I'm also the founding principal investigator for Umbra Search African American History. It's my great honor tonight to introduce Dr. John S. Wright, Professor Emeritus of African American and African Studies and of English. A third-generation University of Minnesota graduate who first matriculated in 1963, Dr. Wright has received degrees in 3 different fields. His PhD in 1977 in American Studies, his dissertation, Ethiopia in Babylon, Antebellum American Romanticism and the Emergence of Black Literary Nationalism, was 500 pages long. That's long. His MA in 1971 in English and American Literature, and his Bachelor's of Electrical Engineering in 1968. As a graduate student, Dr. Wright was a member of the Afro-American Action Committee, the group that took over in 1969 Morrill Hall and demanded the establishment of an African American and African Studies department, a program Dr. Wright helped build. In 1973, Dr. Wright was recruited by Carleton College to found its program in African American Studies. He then returned to the University of Minnesota to chair the Department of African American and African Studies from 1984 to 1989, a position he took up again in 1995. He has twice been appointed a research associate at Harvard University's W.E.B. Du Bois Institute and was a member of its working group on Black intellectual history. He was also a scholar in residence at the New York Public Library's Schomburg Research Center in Black Culture. As a scholar and a beloved teacher, Dr. Wright's studies focus on African American and African cultural, intellectual, and literary history, oral traditions, and cultural movements. He's the author of numerous publications, including Shadowing Ralph Ellison, Art, Leadership, and Technologies of the Spirit, published in 2006 by the University Press of Mississippi. He's lectured and taught all over the world, including in Berlin, Frankfurt, and Munich, at the Swiss Association of North American Studies in Bern, Switzerland, at the University of Sorbonne, Paris, and the University of Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. In 1985, he spearheaded at the University of Minnesota the acquisition of what is now known as the Archie Gibbons Senior Collection of African American Literature. As its founding curator and principal scholar for more than 30 years, Dr. Wright curated two major traveling exhibitions based on the Gibbons collection: A Stronger Soul Within a Finer Frame, portraying African Americans in the Black Renaissance, and Say It Loud, the Black Arts Movement and American Culture, 1960 to 1975. He created statewide teacher trainings in African American literature, convened national literary conferences, published new scholarly editions of out-of-print African American novels, and designed other outreach and educational efforts, essentially bringing out the most special, rare, priceless materials of the library out of the library and into the hands of readers, students, scholars, and the community. He continues to serve as the collection's most trusted advisor, for which I am ever grateful. Select honors include being named CLA Scholar of the College in 1987 and the Morris Amico Distinguished Teaching Professor of African American and African Studies and English at the University of Minnesota. He's the recipient of fellowships from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Bush Foundation, and more. Dr. Wright also served on the advisory board for the University Library's 2017 exhibit, A Campus Divided: Progressives, Anti-Communists, Racism and Anti-Semitism at the University of Minnesota, 1930 to 1942. And he was named by then President Kaler to a committee investigating deliberate racial segregation, anti-Semitism, and surveillance by U leaders at that time. In 2019, Dr. Wright retired from the University of Minnesota. The John S. Wright Luminaries Lecture Series in Africana Studies has been established in his honor. We're so happy to have you here tonight, Dr. Wright. Welcome, Dr. John Wright.
Cecily, that's a marvelous introduction. I hope it hasn't eaten up too much of our time for conversation and dialogue. I want to thank at the outset all those members of the library staff and of the campus club who've collaborated on bringing this event to be. And to all of you who have tuned in tonight to join us for what is now the first Zoom Feast of Words in the history of this particular event. I, in part, want to start by reorienting us a little bit about the idea of a feast of words. The phrase itself apparently originates in the years of the European Renaissance, Italy and France, where it characteristically described one of those grand banquets that were part of courtly tradition in Europe, and that involved, again, both feasting and cultural and ceremonial and performing activities of a variety of kinds. But the idea of a feast of words and of celebrations that combine communal banquets and expressions, again, in words and otherwise, of the human soul and spirit are not limited to the European Renaissance. There is, in fact, a Swahili word, karamu, which is a word, again, for a feast and banquet that's part of the annual celebrations in East African Swahili Coast culture. It's a term that's become part of African American culture in the context of our modern Kwanzaa celebrations. And Kwanzaa ya Imani, all right, or the Feast of Faith, is part of the celebrations that African Americans now observe annually as they pay homage, again, to the African tradition and its global impact. So let me pronounce this Feast of Words also a karamu on our behalf. And I'll say about that, that in terms of the African American cultural historical context, that its use goes back to the World War I era and the founding of a theater, Settlement House Theater in Cleveland, that in 1941 would come to be called Karamu House, and was a place where our distinguished Dean of Poetry, Langston Hughes, labored and performed for the public for a good many years. So, with that said, giving us a cross-cultural context for Feast of Words, let me say that I look forward again to this conversation. First of all, with Cecily Marcus, who has been a marvelous curator of the Gibbons collection for these many years, but also, again, a dialogue with those of you in the audience who may have questions on a variety of fronts about what I'm going to discuss. We were talking about the title for this session, the Unapologetic Omnivore, and I guess that may require a little bit of explanation. Cecily suggests that my array of different fields of academic endeavor may be partial explanation for it, but there's more to it than that, and perhaps I might offer a little explanation in that regard. Although, again, I'm going to try to keep my monologue comparatively short so that Cecily and I can converse, and that you can then, in the audience, can then join us afterwards. I had the great good fortune of being born into the city of Minneapolis in the Phillips neighborhood near Franklin and Chicago, immediately after the Second World War. And I was born into a family, again, very fortunately, that placed great value on the power and the promise, the possibilities of education and learning. So I was encouraged from my very earliest years to read, to observe, to be curious, to explore my various interests in as many ways as possible. And that was reinforced in part by my being named for my grandfather, John S. Wright I, who was himself had been a school teacher in Kentucky, and who had followed members of his family and his wife's family here way out west to Minnesota in the late 19th century as refugees from post-Reconstruction Kentucky. It was in my grandfather's library in the family farm home in Robbinsdale that I first had my encounter again with the world of words on a broad, comprehensive scale. My grandfather, again, who was a kind of gentleman farmer, he was sometimes called, and whom I never saw save in a three-piece Edwardian suit, had built a marvelous home library, several hundred volumes. And it was there that I first had my exposure to the world of books on a wide and varied scale. His library contained the classics. He himself knew Greek and Latin, and it contained not only classical works, anthologies, lexicons, etc., but collections like Bulfinch's Mythology, which was where I got my first exposure again to the classic Greco-Roman mythic traditions. My grandfather also had full sets of the works of James Fenimore Cooper, for instance, on the one hand, and of a variety of poets, English and American poets, included Emerson and Robert and Thoreau and so on. But he also was a race man, as the term was used back then, and his library included volumes of Frederick Douglass and W.E.B. Du Bois, and a first edition of Alain Locke's The New Negro, which would become a central volume in the development of the Harlem Renaissance during the 1920s and 1930s. There were popular texts in my grandfather's library also, and everything again from pulp novels, the novels of Edgar Rice Burroughs on the one hand, to scientific treatises and collections of essays, etc. So very early on, I got exposed again to this wide array of, of, of learned materials and popular materials. My mother, bless her soul, had taught me to read before I started kindergarten at age 4. And I indeed became an omnivorous reader. She encouraged me mightily, as did my father. But my mother had, who, after having led a very impoverished childhood, had herself found great solace in books and the world of words and imagination. So in all those respects, I was very, very fortunate indeed. And as I worked my own way through the educational system, the public education systems of the state of Minnesota, I would find that initial grounding absolutely central for my own development. A point of in which the personal and the professional connect. The oldest text in the Archie Gibbons Senior Collection of African American Literature is a 1773 first edition of the Poems of Phyllis Wheatley, poems on various subjects, religious and moral. And we are very proud in the collection of having, again, these first editions of that particular text. I first became aware of Phyllis Wheatley, however, not as the 18th century poet that she was, but as the woman for whom the Phyllis Wheatley Center in North Minneapolis was named. And a center where my grandmother had formed a very strong partnership with Gertrude Brown, who was the legendary head of the Phyllis Wheatley House during its spectacular years in the 1920s and 1930s. It would be much later that I would encounter Phyllis Wheatley as an author, a writer. And one of the things that my career has tried to do is to place African American writers, thinkers, inventors, scientists, etc., in the broadest kinds of context. And Phyllis Wheatley is perhaps an appropriate place to start. Even today, the single best known poem by Phyllis Wheatley is a poem called On Being Brought from Africa to America. And it's very short. It goes as follows. "'Twas mercy brought me from my pagan land, taught my benighted soul to understand that there's a God, that there's a Savior too. Once I redemption neither sought nor knew. Some view our sable race with scornful eye. Their color is a diabolic dye. Remember, Christians, Negroes black as Cain may be refined and join the angelic train." That brief poem is still the most widely anthologized poem by Phyllis Wheatley. It was, however, a child's Sunday school exercise, written when she was about 12 years old, and it reflected the inculcations of the Protestant and Puritan religious tradition in which she was raised in colonial Boston. It would be years later before I would discover a poem that's an appropriate counterpoint for understanding someone like Phyllis Wheatley. And it's a poem that also was published in that 1773 volume of hers. It's called On Imagination, and I want to just quote 2 brief stanzas from that poem. "Now here, now there, the roving fancy flies, till some loved object strikes her wandering eyes, whose silken fetters all the senses bind, and soft captivity involves the mind. Imagination, who can sing thy force, or who describe the swiftness of thy course, soaring through air to find the bright abode, the imperial palace of the thundering God. We on thy pinions can surpass the wind and leave the rolling universe behind. from star to star, the mental optics rove, measure the skies, and range the realms above. There, in one view, we grasp the mighty whole, or with new worlds amaze the unbounded soul. It's a world of difference between those two poems by Phyllis Wheatley. The childhood Sunday school rhyme, in which she wrestles with the ambivalent religious traditions that African Americans had to confront in the course of becoming New World Christians. That on the one hand, and that second poem on imagination, which is a praise poem to the powers of imagination, here for this woman who was herself a slave, but who found in imagination a way to move beyond those, again, silken fetters that bind the senses and instead free the mind. And in that second stanza, Wheatley makes clear what many of her scholarly commentators have not paid much attention to. She was familiar with, was aware of Isaac Newton's scientific texts of the late 18th century, of Newton's Principia and Newton's optics, the optics in particular that she alludes to here, which was Newton's attempt to explain scientifically the qualities of light, the spectrum of light. And in many ways, Newton could help revolutionize our sense both of the scientific process on the one hand and the links between science and the imagination on the other. That link, again, between the imaginative world of words on the one hand and the worlds of science and so forth, has continued to preoccupy me throughout my career. And it's something I hope we'll get a chance to discuss going forward. These days, I'm engaged in a variety of enterprises that try to bring together the experiences linked to the whole array of scientific and humanities and arts disciplines as they pertain to African American life, thought, and tradition. So with that, perhaps as enough of an opening monologue, I'd like to invite Cecily to help start a conversation between the two of us.
Thank you, Dr. Wright. I just want to let you know we have 269 computers looking at us. So who knows how many people are actually there? Probably more than we might have been able to fit into the campus club had we been able to be there tonight. Thank you for those opening remarks. You know, you have talked tonight and with me, you know, over the years about, again, the range of your interests and how this intellectual insatiability, this Catholic interest with a small c, is something that you share with a number of people, not only in your family, but intellectual mentors of throughout your life. Some you've known and some you haven't. You've described that curiosity, and as a result, on the one hand, of just wanting to learn more and more and being encouraged to do so, but also as a product of the uncertainties of life as a Black man in America. So could you talk a little bit more about how this quest for knowledge has driven you over the course of your career as a student, as a scholar, and as a Black man?
Absolutely. And to go back to what for me is the beginning, I go back again to my first efforts at dealing with the words of the world of words and the absolutely central influence of my mother, who would herself become an elementary school teacher and a specialist in reading, teaching reading, although she was neither of those when she first started reading stories to me as a young child. And she had, again, in our small apartment in the Phillips neighborhood then a collection of children's books. And they included an array of such titles, but one that I particularly remember and that had particular impact on me was Rudyard Kipling's Just So Stories, a collection of what folklorists call etiological tales. That is, tales that try to explain to children the workings of the world, of the universe, things came to be. And one of those stories in particular, it was called The Elephant's Child, or How the Elephant Got Its Tail. And it concludes with a poem that involves the verse that reads, I keep 6 honest serving men. They taught me all I knew. Their names are what and where and when and how and why and who. And I early on recited that poem, and I guess internalized again this question asking heuristic that's put into rhyme there for children. These days, it still survives as what reporters and journalists call the 5 W's that anyone attempting to describe human events needs to address, and doing so holistically. But for me, it was a spur again to ask questions and to not worry about the boundaries that might be crossed in process. And that, I think, is part of what has carried me along all the way. Again, I read omnivorously as a child in school and outside of school, devouring the books at home, again in my grandfather's library, but everything that the school library and the libraries of friends could offer. So that meant that I traversed across again what we know as the disciplines. And of course, with the child's enthusiasm, with little concern about going places that I wasn't supposed to go. Second point, in terms of this catholicity of interests, the idea of the Renaissance man, a Renaissance woman, this is a subject that I have dealt with a good deal in the course of my scholarly career and in the classroom, and talking about the Harlem Renaissance and the idea of Renaissance man, a Renaissance woman, the so-called universal man or woman, master of a variety of fields of endeavor and exploration and artistic accomplishment and so on. But that kind of omnicompetency is not purely a product of, or at least for most people, I don't believe, of raw academic curiosity. Not just curiosity, but necessity has been a driving force in African American life. And so many African Americans who were mentors for me, either whether they were close and personal or farther away, have had lives driven by necessity to absorb, to confront, to try to master a wide variety of fields. At the level of the vernacular, all right, the so-called jackleg, all right, or master of all trades in vernacular terms, became a common figure in African American life, in part because so many African Americans have had to learn to do a wide variety of things in order to survive in the world. My father, who graduated from the University School of Mortuary Science in the 1930s and had a scientific education, also went to Dunwoody, all right, to Dunwoody Woodworking and Industrial Arts School. All right. My grandfather, again, who had, again, a training in Latin and Greek, all right, became, as I said, also a farm owner, and learned again to operate in those multiple worlds. One of the a close family friend, who has strong Minnesota links here, Gordon Parks, was the kind of Renaissance man who, in his own terms, had learned to master so many different fields, whether it was photography or film or athletics or
fashion,
so on and so forth, because he said he had grown up so poor that he never wanted to be that poor again and mastered so many fields as he did, and without graduating from high school, simply in order to survive, to have the widest range of possibilities open to him. So, combination of necessity on the one hand and curiosity on the other.
Can you talk a little bit about who some of those other mentors are, and maybe specifically, what is it in Ralph Ellison that has, driven you so compellingly?
Well, I was very fortunate to have a relationship with Ralph and Fanny Ellison, in part as an outgrowth of the very first academic conference on Ralph's life and works, which was held at Brown University back in 1979. And my very close friend and collaborator, the poet Michael Harper, helped organize. And in the context of that Ellison Festival of 1979, I edited the proceedings, so forth, Ralph's speeches and writing for it, as well as a wide array of marvelous scholars. I developed a very close relationship with Ralph and Fanny Ellison during the last 15 years of Ralph's life. And it in part was Ralph's, besides his novel Invisible Man, which is one of the great novelistic masterpieces of the 20th century, his collection of essays, Shadow and Act, is a marvelous cultural document in its own right and stands, or ought to stand, on a level with Du Bois's Souls of Black Folk. Well, part of the opening section of Shadow and Act, Ralph deals with the idea of Renaissance man and woman as he encountered it himself in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, as a junior high school in a class taught by a Black teacher, again, amidst the rise of the Harlem Renaissance, in which this idea of Renaissance omnicompetency became part of the vernacular world also. Ralph saw it at work in the world of the jazz musicians to whom he was so close, so intently drawn. But he saw it operative in African-American life, again, in a variety of other ways. Ralph was the most eloquent articulator of this revised, this vernacular notion of Renaissance omnicompetency that I would encounter along the way. And we had some wonderful discussions in the course of our times together in the past talking about it.
You said that you're working on a project about African American intellectual and literary history that focuses mostly on the 19th century, but that this sprawling project has led you to pursue all different kinds of subjects, everything from artisan fields and the occult to games like Mancala that date back to, as you said, as you told me today, likely before the 2nd century AD. Can you walk us through just one example of how one interest in your life has led to another?
Okay, I'll try to be brief on this, Cecily. I had the great good fortune to become part of a working group on Black intellectual history at Harvard's W.E.B. Du Bois Institute many years ago. Again, beginning with multiple sojourns there in the 1980s, and then later in the early 1990s. While there, I encountered a volume, a first edition, the very first African-American literary magazine. So this is called the Anglo-African Magazine, which was published in New York City in 1859 and 1860. It was a marvelous compendium of essays from the leaders of African-American cultural and intellectual and political life in the middle of the 19th century, in the years leading up to Civil War. And names that the audience will be familiar with, like Frederick Douglass, are included there, and Martin Delany, and many, many others. But what particularly caught my attention was an unsigned essay on chess, that focused on the very first National American Chess Congress, a national tournament to determine the best chess player in the United States. It was held in New York in 1857, and which was won by a New Orleans Creole prodigy named Paul Morphy, who was to the 19th century what Bobby Fischer was to the 20th century. That is a child prodigy who became the best chess player on the planet. And this unnamed essay in the Anglo-African magazine was written amidst this first national fervor interest in, of course, the ancient board game, abstract strategy board game of chess. And it was a wonderfully sophisticated essay that was concerned, on the one hand, with what were the intellectual faculties that went into making a superlative chess player, as was Paul Morphy, and the German chess master exile, Louis Paulsen, whom he played in that tournament. But this essay on chess also alluded to a group of young Black men, most of whom were the offspring of Black mothers, either slave or free, and of white fathers who denied paternity and who had had to navigate the world of the middle of the 19th century without an official father's guidance or aid. They were also all radical abolitionists as well. And they were all part of a group who played chess together and were there at this first chess congress. I had never seen an essay focusing on the play lives of free Black folk before. We know more about the play lives of slaves than we do about the lives of free antebellum folk in the North. And so this essay particularly intrigued me. And part of what the writer had done was to try to track the ways in which the playing styles, not just of the two great masters, but also of this cluster of young Black players, the way in which their ways of playing chess reflected their personalities. It was also concerned about the role of games and play in social change and the need and the struggle for freedom to think strategically. So exploring that essay became a launching point for tracking the lives of the individual players involved and trying to understand the whole milieu and history of abstract strategy board games, which I came to understand then also included the variants of Afro-Asian Mancala that slaves had brought to the New World with them. So it's a kind of a long way of framing the subject, but that's a project that has intrigued me for many years now, and I and my marvelous wife, Serena, have spent a significant time in the past decade or so traveling to different parts of the African world, trying to study and research the tradition of Mancala abstract strategy board games.
Well, and sort of related, this is a question from someone in the audience asking what prompted your shift from studying electrical engineering to, without really missing a beat, as a graduate student studying African American literature and American studies?
Well, it's a shift, I guess, is one way of describing it. But I tend to think of it more in terms of becoming whole. Becoming whole. I ended up completing a degree in electrical engineering, in part because I had some facility with the sciences and mathematics early on, and in junior high and high school was part of a group of what they then called accelerated students who had access to university and college courses, again, prior to matriculating at the university. And we had a chance to explore, again, the whole spectrum of the arts and humanities, as well as the sciences and social sciences as well. I had interest in almost all of these things. All right. But as one of my high school teachers told me at the time, engineering is the profession of the future. You will always have a place in the larger economy with an engineering degree, and the arts and humanities may be less certain of things. So in part, it was a pragmatic approach that led me into electrical engineering, but it was by no means a divorce from my interest in the arts and humanities and so on. I guess one of my experiences in high school was being administered the Strong and Cooter interest tests that are linked to the Minnesota multiphasic personality scales that I think are still in use here and that were developed in part at this university. But those scales had a gendered component that identified the arts and humanities with the feminine and the so-called hard sciences with the masculine. And I can recall my conversation with a high school counselor who remarked that my array of interests clearly bridged both of these. I had very strong feminine interests in arts and humanities, something as an adolescent I perhaps didn't fully understand, but nonetheless, I held in place. And it would take my collegiate years and my collision again with the era of the Vietnam War and the battle over the draft that would ultimately lead to the collisions that would lead me finally back into the arts and the humanities.
So I want to ask you about April 26, 2019, when you were present at the Board of Regents meeting just weeks before your retirement, where you had been a student and professor for the better part of 50 years. And you were there to represent not only your work and that of your colleagues on the task force for building, renaming, and institutional history, the task force that came out of the Campus Divided exhibit in 2017, but also to bear witness to the university's failure, as you put it, to grapple with its own past. And I went back and I watched the recording of those of that meeting, because one of the great things about a public university in the state of Minnesota is that this is an open record campus, and all of those meetings are open to the public. And I was struck by how you stood there silently for more than an hour and a half while various regents spoke, many of whom disparaged or dismissed the recommendations and some the integrity of the task force's report. And then you stood silently for another 10 minutes where some of the members of the boards of regent were threatening to eject you and the group of students and colleagues who were there, threatened to have you arrested. And you were surrounded by your colleagues, and you were standing literally at the head of this, semicircular table, waiting patiently while your colleagues and some of your students exhorted the board to allow you to speak. They yielded whatever time they were given to you. They corrected the regent, who, even after 56 years and all of the work that you have done to really help transform this university, the regent who didn't know your name, who called you, he said, is it Mr. Rice? You stood silently before you were finally given 10 minutes, and you then took the opportunity to speak extemporaneously, or at least that's how it seemed to me, about a whole range of things. You talked about your family's roots at the university, going back to 1901, as you've mentioned tonight. You talked about the university's unfinished work regarding the demands of the Afro-American Action Committee from 1969, how for more than 80 years it's public knowledge, the university's history of racism, and that knowledge is documented not necessarily in the university archives, but in the Twin Cities Black press. And then the role that the university has had in, or had had in making that history invisible. You talked about the chilling effects, as you put it, of the university's refusal to acknowledge and address practices and policies, past and present, that seek to separate and silence and demean African American students on this campus. One of the chilling effects you mentioned was the generations of Black families choosing not to send their kids to the University of Minnesota. You spoke about the obligation and the integrity of the need to grapple with one's own past, that we have to do that if we take seriously the value of higher education and the responsibility of teaching generations of thinkers. So can you talk a little bit about what it was like for you to be in that room? You projected such a sense of patience and decorum that so far exceeded many of those around you. What were you thinking about as you stood there silently in the moments before you spoke?
There's not a simple answer to that, Cecily, but clearly I felt the need to keep faith with my ancestors and my ancestral community here locally, as well as with the broader principles upon which this land grant university was founded. And that again took me back into my grandparents, my grandfather, again, who had organized perhaps the earliest example that we have been able to record thus far of a local African American institution. In this case, the Baptist Church to which my grandfather belonged, the oldest Black Baptist church in Minneapolis, attempt to engage African American university students in matters of common concern. My grandfather had organized a debate at Bethesda Baptist Church in 1901, and he invited 3 University of Minnesota Black law students or recent law graduates to participate in this debate at Bethesda Baptist Church. And it was a debate dealing with the issues that African Americans has been confronting nationally at the end of the 19th century after the Plessy versus Ferguson Supreme Court case of 1896 that gave judicial sanction to racial segregation. The state of Minnesota, as has happened in other states afterwards, had passed the following year, in part because of the energies of the local Black citizenry and their allies, had passed anti-discrimination laws in opposition to the Plessy versus Ferguson decision. My grandfather had organized a debate that essentially focused on the implications of that and how African American communities ought to organize. The following year, he was part of a planning group for the National Afro-American Council, which was the first national African-American civil rights organization. It was the predecessor to the NAACP. And they had a conference here in St. Paul, brought the greatest leaders of the nation to Minneapolis and St. Paul to discuss a whole array of issues. And they concluded that convention with a session held at the university's campus in the Armory building in 1902. W.B. Du Bois, Ida B. Wells, Booker T. Washington, T. Thomas Stewart, a whole long list of them were all there. My grandfather was part of the mix. Frederick McGee, the local lawyer again, who Du Bois credited with helping found the NAACP, was the primary organizer. My grandfather ran 2 of the organizing committees for that conference. So we had this history in the family of engagement with the university and dealing with community university kinds of concerns that had been left essentially out of the official history of our institution. And this had been compounded in the 1930s when my father and my aunt both came to the university in 1934 and had to confront the Jim Crow policies of then University President Lotus Kaufman. My aunt was one of no more than 4 or 5 women in what was then called the School of Technology. And she was the only African American. She had been a classroom valedictorian, the valedictorian of North High School class of 1934. But the university sororities, fraternities were all segregated at the time. The office of the president, with the support of the regents, again, this all was dealt with, of course, in the exhibit on the Campus Divided, were essentially supporting this Jim Crow policies that were in clear violation of those anti-discrimination laws that had been passed back in 1897 and that the Black law students my grandfather worked with had put to work in their own defense decades before. All that was bubbling through my mind as I tried to make this extemporaneous speech to regents whom I knew had no understanding and no grasp of that long history.
Thank you. Well, you addressed your Aunt Martha, which was another one of the audience's questions, but there have been a couple of questions about your fashion. Could you explain the insignias on your shirt? And then another wants to know what is the significance of the hat that you do always wear?
All right. Not exactly a detour. The embroidery here on the shirt I'm wearing is Egyptian in origin. The outer pattern is a pattern, again, of a lotus flowers that had symbolic significance in ancient Egyptian religion. At the center here is a cartouche, which is the oval in hieroglyphic Egyptian hieroglyphic traditions, in which royal names were transcribed. So that's the basic design behind this. The hat I'm wearing, the beret, and the image on front, which is often taken to be a military symbol, but actually is not. The symbol itself is also Egyptian. It's the winged scarab, the earthly emblem of the royal dung beetle that in Egyptian cosmology rolls the solar orb through the heavens day by day, turns dark into light, day into night, and is represented by the god Khepra, again, the god of rebirth and resurrection. So the military beret has essentially been demilitarized by the winged scarab.
Thank you, and thank you for indulging in the detour. Someone is asking from the audience if you are writing or considering writing a memoir about your battles and legacy of racism at the University of Minnesota. Writing. All of us would so benefit by your sharing your tremendous history and insight. Thank you for all that you've done.
Well, I appreciate the question. I'm not presently working on a memoir, although I am working very energetically on family history, on trying to track again the history of both my parental and maternal sides of the family, and have enlisted a variety of assistance in that process. So again, we all have fascinating histories once we begin to really wrestle with them. And I promised my mother and other family elders that I would do my best to try to bring together again those elements of family history that had not been properly archived, in part so that we can share them with a younger generation now. Again, my aunt Martha, again, the brilliant mathematician, who was both the president of the Council of Negro Students, the first Black student organization at this university, and also the head of the AKAs on campus at the same time. My aunt was also our primary family historian for the paternal side of my family. And so again, I've been trying to assemble those details. Whether that results in a memoir, a book, that sort remains to be seen.
You also have alluded to your mother's influence. Can you say more about her as well?
Yeah, my mother was an extraordinary woman. She's that side of the family is West Indian in origin. My mother was part of the big influx of immigrants from the British West Indies right at the beginning of the 20th century, in the decades before the First World War. The same influx that brought people like Marcus Garvey again to this country. My mother's people came from Barbados and ended up in Boston. And she grew up there in that context, retained Barbadian links in a variety of ways, and helped, at least in my case, to trigger some interest in that West Indian set of Caribbean connections for us also. She performed the amazing feat, from my vantage point looking back now. She had originally been trained in Boston in business, and had been trained as an executive secretary back in those days, but at a time when Boston was notoriously racist city and professionally educated Black folks had little professional opportunities. She, however, was recruited by the president of Savannah State College to come to Savannah, Georgia, and become his executive assistant, which she did. So she had a very important link to the historically Black colleges and universities. And here the linkage, the family linkage, broadens a bit more because it was there that she met my aunt, Martha, who, after graduating here from the School of Technology and getting a master's degree in education, being denied employment in education here in Minnesota, had also been recruited to go to Savannah State College in Savannah, Georgia, and become a faculty member in the Department of Mathematics, where she remained for the bulk of her professional career, ultimately became dean and acting president and so forth. My aunt and my mother became close friends at Savannah State, and my aunt then introduced her close friend, my mother, May, to her older brother, Boyd, who had graduated again from the university's School of Mortuary Science and had been unable to get professional appointments here in Minnesota with his training, and had gone south to Georgia, to Atlanta, to work in one of the large Black funeral homes there. So we had this fascinating link here in the family history of three northern-born, college-educated Black folks migrating back into the segregated Jim Crow South for professional opportunity, which my mother again took great advantage of. She would later on, in her mid-40s, go back, start as a freshman at the university in education, get a bachelor's degree and then a master's degree in special education, would teach in schools on the north side of Minneapolis for more than a quarter of a century as part of a very small group of African-American teachers in the Minneapolis school system in the 1970s, 80s, so on.
Well, this is a comment from the audience. Just a heartfelt thank you for your historic knowledge, your wisdom, your ability to connect the dots between our history then and our history today. Your family genealogy is also so powerful. Another question that came through from a former student at the U during the takeover of Morrill Hall during that time. Can you talk about the motivation and the results of that takeover?
Well, the roots of the takeover.
And in like 4 minutes or less.
Well, I've talked about this in a variety of contexts, but I'll try to be brief. The roots of the takeover lay in the assassination of Martin King in the spring of 1968, on April 4th of 1968. Our Black student organization on campus, prior to that time, had originally been called STRAP, Students for Racial Progress. and we had managed to bring Dr. King to the university campus in the spring of 1967, in April of 1967, 1 year almost to the date prior to his assassination. The assassination of Dr. King on April 4th of 1968 generated reverberations around this country. African Americans and our allies around the country rose in rebellion, and American cities went up in flames, more than 100 such cities. And this was taking place over a weekend. We, as members of our student organization, we had changed our student organization's name from STRAP to the Afro-American Action Committee. We met on campus in the Union beginning of the following week, and tried to decide how we could respond in a way that would both honor Dr. King and lead to constructive social change on campus and in the larger community. The group asked me to draft a response, and I framed what became the 7 demands that we presented the following week to then President Malcolm Moose and his administration. The university formed a task force, as universities, of course, can be expected to do, to study the problem. And 8 months later, with little to show for that process, we met again with representatives of President Moose's administration, found their responses inadequate, and then decided to take nonviolent direct action in the spirit of Dr. King to pursue those original demands from the previous April.
Well, I know that there is much more that we could continue to talk about, and I think our audience would probably stick with us, but thank you, Dr. Wright, for having this conversation with me and with all of us.
Well, I really appreciate this opportunity. Again, it's been an honor to join the illustrious legacy of the Feast of Words presenters. And again, this very first Zoom Feast of Words, we hope will be the last in this modality. We hope we'll be returning to more traditional forms of exchange in the future. But again, my thanks to all those who've helped work so hard to make this event take place, and to all of you who've joined us for this exchange.
Dr. Wright and Cecily, thank you so much. This was riveting, and there are so many people who have so many questions. I hope we might have to have a part 2. So I hope you'll consider that at some point. I did want to share too, one of the comments that was in the Q&A, because I can't say it any better. She says, Carrie Winter says, in an academy that often rewards minuscule specialization, he opens us to the universe of insatiable learning. And boy, I know I learned a great deal tonight. So I just thank you. And thank you, Cecily, for your fabulous, fabulous questions. I do want to share that tonight's program was sponsored by the Friends of the University Libraries and the Campus Club. And for those friends who joined us today, we appreciate your support and your commitment. And for those of you who are not yet friends, we invite you to join us. To do so, please go to lib.umn.edu/friends. Our next Friends Forum, a series of Curious Minds event, is John Berryman's Selected Letters, a transatlantic celebration. Letters by the late poet held in our Upper Midwest literary archives were used for the book, which sheds the light on his life and work. Poet and critic Peter Campion will moderate this event, which will include readings by the book editors and invited guests from both sides of the Atlantic. Join us on March 3rd at 3 p.m. Central Time, and the reservation form is available at z.umn.edu Friends Forum. So everyone, Dr. Wright, Cecily, audience, thank you so much. And thank you to all of you who have worked so hard to make this program possible. Thank you.
Thank you.